Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Mormon Stories Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. John DeLynn. It is January 24th, 2022, and we have a very important story that we're covering today on Mormon Stories Podcast. We are committed to covering current events that relate to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and its members and former members. And a really big story that hit the news recently is the federal investigation into Brigham Young University. And specifically, we're talking about the way that the Mormon Church, through BYU Provo, BYU Idaho, BYU Hawaii, the way the Mormon Church deals with its LGBTQ plus students. This story has been covered very well in the Salt Lake Tribune. Unfortunately, that article is behind a paywall. It's also been covered in the Deseret News, the Washington Times, and on some of the major news media outlets. But it has to do with what are, active believing Mormons who are LGBTQ BYU students. What are they allowed to do? Are they allowed to be out in the public square? Are they allowed to hold hands? Are they allowed to date like other straight students? Are they allowed to light up BYU's Y in Provo and just show love and support? Are they allowed to carry around rainbow umbrellas or wear rainbow pins? And more importantly, do the BYUs, are they entitled to federal funding if they're violating the rights of their LGBTQ students, if they're treating them unfairly? And should BYU be accredited as a major national university, or should it lose its accreditation as a result of its treatment of LGBTQ students? And then finally, to what extent is the Mormon Church and BYU going to continue to experience, what some might say is a black eye or a drop in enrollment, poor reputation as it relates to its treatment of LGBTQ students? So those are some of the questions we are going to be dealing with today, and we're super grateful to Gerardo Samano, one of my partners in goodness and righteousness. Gerardo has kind of been the producer for this episode. We want to welcome you, as always, Gerardo. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, John. I'm really excited for this episode. As some of our listeners know, this is a subject that I'm really passionate about. So really, really excited.
All right. Yeah, thanks for all the work of making this happen, Gerardo. And we also have with us, I believe, returning to Mormon Stories Podcast, at least one, if not both of them. The first is Paul Southwick. Paul, do you mind just introducing yourself really briefly to our audience?
Sure. Thanks for having me. My name is Paul Southwick. I'm the director of the Religious Exemption Accountability Project, and we work to empower queer, trans, and non-binary students who experience discrimination on religious campuses like BYU. And one of the primary ways we do that is through litigation and through filing Title IX complaints. So this topic is right up our alley.
All right. Yeah, we're really grateful. And this is not your first appearance on Mormon Stories, correct, Paul?
That's right. I appeared several months back when we filed a class action Title IX lawsuit against the U.S. Department of Education on behalf of what is now over 40 LGBTQ students, including 3 of whom go to BYU institutions.
All right. Well, thanks for joining us again, Paul. And Joe Baxter, please also let us know a little bit about yourself. Welcome to Mormon Stories Podcast, Joe.
Yeah, it's good to see everyone again. My name is Joe Baxter. I'm an attorney working with the Religious Exemption Accountability Project alongside Paul. I received my law degree from Lewis and Clark Law School in Portland. I focused on the intersection of LGBTQ plus rights with religious liberty. I began working with REAP in May of this last year. I also have a little bit of personal connection with this. I grew up in a Mormon family. I attended Brigham Young University, Idaho, was a Mormon missionary to Chile. So I have a little bit of background on the LDS aspect of this as well. So really excited to be here. Thanks, Gerardo and for inviting us on, and John, appreciate it.
My pleasure. Okay, so there's a lot to get into today. We want to try and be as tight as possible so that we can maximize the number of people that really pay attention and connect with what's going on. Let's just start not in the legal level, but let's just start at the human level. And maybe Paul, you can start, and then Joe, you can add to it. BYU is under federal investigation for the way it treats LGBTQ students. So if you can humanize this, Paul, and just tell us, what it is. And by the way, about half of our viewers and listeners on Mormon Stories podcast have never been Mormon. So a lot of them don't even know what BYU is or how LGBTQ students are being treated. So what I kind of want to do before we kind of get into Title IX and the legal stuff and the accreditation and the complaints is just to kind of explain at a human level what's going on with BYU LGBTQ students, why it's not right, and why the federal government, the U.S. federal government, the Department of Education, would actually be investigating BYU because of the complaints. So, Paul, can you start with that description, and then Joe will have you add some color to that?
Thank you. Well, a lot of LGBTQ young people end up at religious colleges like BYU. At a place like BYU, the religion permeates the college experience. And so that might mean that you have mandatory chapel sessions that you attend, that there is prayer in some or all of your classes. It also usually means that there is an honor code that significantly regulates how people are allowed to look, act, what they can say, what they can advocate for. So I was one of these, a closeted LGBT student at a religious college when I was younger, and it was a really scary place to be. I constantly received messages that I was evil, that I was perverted, and I heard that from speakers, from professors, and eventually was sent to conversion therapy. And these are kinds of things that continue to persist today in various forms. And so what we're talking about when we're looking at LGBTQ students on these campuses is really vulnerable 18, 19, 20-year-olds who for the first time might be exploring their sexual orientation or gender identity, but they constantly have to watch their backs. And that takes an extreme emotional toll.
And as kind of a follow-up to that, I was just talking to one of our students. Two of our investigations just started to be, two of our Title IX complaints of our students just started to be investigated. And when I had a phone call with the student to talk to him and tell him that his complaint was being investigated, he broke down crying because he said, I felt like I have deserved this whole time. They've told me that I'm broken, that I'm wrong, and I felt like I deserve to be discriminated against. And the fact that you guys are working to fight this discrimination, that the OCR is opening up an investigative complaint, it validates all of this pain that I've been feeling. It says that you didn't deserve this, maybe that this something was happening to you that was wrong. It's not that you were bad. And so this whole it's very difficult for students on these campuses because they're being told continually over and over and over again that they're wicked or they're bad or they're broken. And that's just simply not true.
Yeah. So I prepared 3 questions, which are the ones that I feel like you guys and we do as well always seem to come up when we're talking about this issue of the honor code, BYU, and LGBTQ students, and we would love for you to address them. I think that's where we can start with this. And so the first one is, the argument is that there's an honor code. They agreed to it before, and even attending the university, they signed it. So students know what they're signing up for when they go to these religious universities like BYU. What would be your response for people who claim this?
Right. So essentially that argument boils down to, you knew what you were getting into, so you deserve the treatment that you got. And that really is a response that puts the blame on a young person who probably at the time they were applying to college, they didn't want to be gay or they didn't want to be trans. They were trying to conform to the image that they were taught by their families and their religious communities was the correct, right image for them. And so, yes, many of them willingly signed on to the honor code in the hopes that it would help them, live what they thought was a righteous life. But then when you get there and you realize, maybe for the first time, that what you thought you were signing up for turns out to be something far more painful, far more scary, and very unsafe for you. And so at that point where a student's safety is on the line, we shouldn't be blaming them for decisions that they or their families made for them when they were 17 years old.
Is it okay, really quickly, if I jump in and just provide a little color for people that don't, maybe for people who don't have the Mormon background? I'll just say the honor code, as I recall, is, you go to you're a senior in high school, you go to your bishop and you say, "Hey, bishop, I'm Mormon bishop. I want to go to BYU." And he says, "Okay, to go to BYU, you got to fill out this you got to sign this honor code where you promise to not engage in any sexual activity while at BYU other than maybe hand holding or kissing." And I think it would be clear from everyone's perspective that would only be heterosexual hand holding or kissing, but that any other sexual activity, gay or straight, well, straight for sure, beyond kissing or hand holding would be forbidden and would be grounds for you to be removed. You're also going to commit to not drinking tea, to not drinking coffee, to not drinking alcohol, to not doing drugs, to not lying or stealing or cheating, and to rat out or, turn in anyone that you know of who is also violating the honor code. So, and then I don't think a gay student who's talking to their Mormon bishop, I don't even think it would be on the table their senior year in high school to be thinking about whether they'd be allowed to hold hands or kiss or date a gay student while at BYU. Now, Gerardo, you've actually lived this, so why don't you tell me if I've painted the right picture of the honor code for those who just don't have the context?
No, that was a great explanation, right? Like, just my personal experience was I decided to go to BYU Idaho right after I came back from my mission. I knew I was gay or I had same-sex attraction, but I was super committed to live, like the Mormon lifestyle and to push through it. But like Paul said, I never imagined how hard it would be, what other experiences were going to come up right like during my 4 years at the university.
And Gerardo, tell us what it's like really quickly. So you're a Mormon, faithful Mormon kid. You go to BYU or BYU Idaho. You want to be straight. You want the gay to go away. You made this promise. What's really hard about being a BYU student and a gay BYU student once you're there and once you start experiencing everything that's around you? What's super hard about that? About not dating someone of the same sex in your case? What
Right.
makes it super hard or excruciating?
Well, you just feel lonely, feel depressed. I knew so many people who tried the celibate route and they were always on antidepressants and anxiety. Many of us feel like we can't come out because BYU Idaho is super conservative. What people are going to say. Usually when students come out, their bishops will have kind of like a spotlight on them and be checking them constantly on everything they do, have like super demanding callings so bishops can make sure that they have them on track. And, even if a BYU is openly gay and saying that they're committed to live the church's standards, like they will be really grilled into like, you need to show us that that's true. And so, yeah, it's just a really, really hard experience. Many students experience discrimination from other students. There's classes where there's demeaning stuff said about homosexuals or people who have same gender attraction. It's just a really hard experience, and that, like Paul said, you don't usually account when you're 17 signing your papers to go to BYU or coming back from your mission when you have like a super strong testimony, you know.
It's gotta also be super hard that the Mormon church is always emphasizing dating and marriage. And if you can't date some of the opposite sex because you're literally not attracted to them, or you experience aversion towards them, and then everybody else is dating, you're just sitting home alone or with your friends. That's got to be a really sad and difficult thing to just watch around you as you're just feeling lonelier and lonelier and lonelier. Is that right, Gerardo?
Yeah, for sure. And I think this takes us to the next argument that I wanted to address, which is that many people give, you know, that us students who are LGBT, we have thousands of other universities that we could go. We could always leave if we wanted. Like, no one's forcing us to be at these universities with these honor codes. Well, Paul can touch a little bit on this, but preliminary, just at least for BYU, it's really hard, and BYU Idaho, it's really hard to transfer your credits out. Sometimes you're like a year or 2 years in the university when you find out that you accept yourself that you're gay, because many times, you know, we grew up with internalized homophobia, which doesn't allow us to accept ourselves, and it happens later down the road. But Paul, what other ideas you have around this argument that, you know, these students have many other options that they could choose?
We should get Joe in after Paul too.
Right. Well, first of all, a lot of students feel like they really don't have much of a choice, and to begin with, because it's kind of like your whole growing up, you thought, I'm going to be a BYU student, and you kind of have tunnel vision. Now, once you're there, and if you do come out or you are struggling by being closeted there, you might think about, okay, how can I leave? How can I get out of here? And then a lot of difficulties arise. Like Gerardo mentioned, transferring credits can be difficult. But also, a place like BYU is very affordable for students. And if a student is to leave BYU, it might be financially impossible or very difficult for them to transfer to another institution. Also, places like BYU and other religious colleges, sometimes they have like the best departments or the best programs for a certain area. And so a student might actually be sacrificing the quality of their education by having to go to a program or a department that's, you know, not quite as good. And also, a big part of college is the social aspect, and you make friendships and you make relationships with people while you're there on campus. And it's a pretty hard thing to do, especially if you're closeted and Mormon, to then think about, you know, leaving those friendships and going into a completely different world.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think if some of your listeners are maybe struggling to kind of understand the mindset of these students, I don't know if either of you saw this, but last week, David Archuleta posted this really brave, beautiful video to Instagram where for 45 minutes, he talks about all of the messages he received as a kid about how his life was supposed to be, how he was supposed to grow up and marry a woman, and how he tried so hard to live that life that they told him he had to live. And you can watch the pain on his face as he talks about trying to reconcile who he was with who he was being pressured to be. And he was fighting. I mean, it took him to really, really, really dark places emotionally, because, you know, he was trying to exist in a complete, you know, suppress so many things. It was really harmful for him mentally. It was really painful for him mentally. And I think this is what these students go through. They grow up in these environments where they've been told that, you know, you go to the BYUs, you get married. This is the way you have to do it. This is what God wants you to do. So of course they're going to end up there. And, you know, they've suppressed all of these feelings and are trying really hard, but it's really painful. It's a really difficult place to be. And I think kind of seeing that helps you put yourself in their shoes and kind of understand on a level of empathy what these students are going through and why you shouldn't blame them. It's kind of victim blaming to say, like, why did you decide to go there? And, you know, you wouldn't say this to any other group. We wouldn't say like, oh, you shouldn't belong here. These are schools that receive government funds. Everybody should be welcome to go there. We shouldn't say like, oh, you know, you belong, go to a different school. No, schools should be inclusive. It's on the burden on the schools to make sure that they're inclusive.
Yeah. I think we can, John, we can start addressing, well, there's one more last argument, and Joe, you touched on it, but this argument that the government is overreaching on a private institution, and that particularly a religious one, and the government shouldn't be interfering. But like Joe responded beautifully to this, which is these universities are getting millions of taxpayer money every year, you know, and that they should be held accountable for this discrimination.
While you're mentioning that, Gerardo, maybe it's time to show kind of this, the first couple slides. Do you want to explain what these slides are, Gerardo?
Yeah, so this is from .gov website. It's called usaspending.gov. And this page is called Explore the Federal Investment in Your Alma Mater. And it has how much money this universities all around the U.S. received during the year of 2018. And this is BYU Provo, and according to the report, it says that BYU Provo received at least $118 million in the year of 2018. And then the next slide is a screenshot of BYU Idaho, which received $133 million on federal aid.
That's a lot of dollars.
Yeah.
That's a tenth of a bill. That was more than $1/10 billion in one year.
Right.
That's a lot.
Right.
Yeah. So Paul and Joe, what can you guys tell us about why BYU's and the Mormon Church are under federal investigation? That sounds so serious, right? Why are they under federal investigation? Then we can dive into Title IX and the history of that. But just for somebody who doesn't want to hear the legalese, why are they under investigation? Paul, maybe go first.
Sure, John. Well, you're completely right. It is a very serious matter for the federal government, Office of Civil Rights, to open up an investigation. And why they are being investigated is it doesn't have to do with the specific treatment of any individual student. This is really significant. It actually has to do with the investigation is focused on the honor code policies as applied to all LGBTQ students. So they're not just investigating, for example, if one student experienced a homophobic conduct and reported that. They're actually doing a system-wide, BYU-wide evaluation of those anti-LGBT policies and the effects that those have on LGBTQ students, and whether or not BYU is now out of compliance with federal law.
And Paul, how has this happened before? Is this kind of new? Is this groundbreaking? Like, or does this happen every day?
No, this is pretty rare that the federal government will open an investigation with respect to a religious institution to begin with, and then also a evaluation of the policies of the religious institution, as opposed to a specific student making a complaint and evaluating that very specific complaint. So again, this is focused on BYU as an entire entity, and it is investigated. It is already essentially done in what's called the evaluation stage. So before you get to an investigation, the federal government is first going to evaluate a complaint that comes in the door. And so at this point, the complaint has already passed the evaluation stage, and now the investigation is open.
Is the complaint public? Do we have an access to the complaint so that we can?
Unfortunately, complaints filed by individual folks are not public. They're not automatically on the government's website. However, you can get them through a FOIA request, for a Freedom of Information Act request. My understanding is that the Salt Lake Tribune and some other outlets have made those FOIA requests. So I would anticipate we'll be seeing that underlying letter. But what we essentially know about the complaint that kickstarted all this was it had to do actually back in 2020. So this was when Trump was still in office. someone from the BYU community filed a complaint with the Department of Education when the whole dating ban fiasco happened, where BYU said, okay, LGBTQ students can date, and then, oh, never mind, they can't date anymore. And that prompted a complaint back in March of 2020. Well, it looks like the Trump administration just kind of sat on that complaint. And then when we had the new administration come in, they've developed a completely new procedure for how they evaluate Title IX complaints that might raise religious exemption issues when a school like BYU is the subject of the complaint. And so they've put it through this new process. And finally, I think it was October of 2021 is when they actually opened the investigation. And as far as we know, it's ongoing, though BYU is fighting it.
I think this is an important point just to spend a couple more minutes on. So prior to a couple years ago, either Paul or Gerardo or Joe, prior to a couple years ago, the honor code said basically what as it related to LGBTQ kids. And so what was it before? And then when the change happened, what changed, and then why did it change, if we can speculate?
Yeah. So before the change, before 2020, the honor code at every LDS school was a little bit different. So BYU Idaho had a little bit different honor code than BYU Provo and BYU Hawaii. The honor code, I'll just talk about Idaho really quick. So BYU Idaho had just like a few letters. It was part of a sentence on what it called homosexual behavior. Now, that was up to interpretation what homosexual behavior was. And that language came directly from the Handbook of Instructions that since at least 2006, the Handbook of Instructions had been including that language of homosexual behavior being against the law of chastity. Now, there was not any definition of what homosexual behavior was. One could just imagine that any kind of homosexual, it doesn't have to be sexual, but any kind of, same-sex behavior would be against the law of chastity. Now, BYU Provo's honor code included, I think it was at least a couple sentences talking about what homosexual behavior was. And he talked about it was romantic behavior, and he kind of gave a definition to homosexual behavior. But in 2020, the Handbook of Instructions from the church changed. And now that all the homosexual behavior language was removed. I mean, it's still there on the title of a section, but it was removed from the actual explanation of what is against the law of chastity. And supposedly what we know is that the honor codes then were updated to reflect that change on the General Handbook of Instructions. So the honor code was standardized throughout all LDS schools, and they completely removed all language of homosexual behavior. So now the only thing that the honor code says is that students should live the law of chastity and not have sexual relations outside of marriage. So this made everyone, including students, to believe that BYU schools were going to start allowing same-sex dating and same-sex romantic behavior. And during 2 weeks, the news was covering this. Students were holding hands, kissing, and taking pictures on campus. And then 2 weeks after this announcement, or actually after it was made known that the BYU had changed its honor code, the director of I think is a director that's in charge of CS. He's a general authority. He put out a letter explaining that while it was removed from the honor code, same-sex romantic behavior was still violating the spirit of the honor code, pretty much.
And really quickly, I don't know if Paul or Joe or Gerardo want to kind of speculate. What do you think was the intent of the Mormon Church in changing the honor code and removing same-sex behavior as being specifically enumerated in the honor code? Were there were they foreseeing potential legal? Were they trying to like avoid potential legal repercussions? Was it envisioning a lot of these lawsuits? Paul, you go first, and then Joe, I want to hear if you guys have speculations in this regard.
Well, John, I mean, that's a really good question, but I would say, at least for me, it would be pure speculation. I'm not sure why the church would have made that change, given that they still intended to enforce honor code penalties for LGBTQ students who engaged in that kind of behavior. So, one could imagine a variety of scenarios. There can be, a lot of big institutions like BYU. They get funding from not only the federal government, but also from large grant-making organizations, foundations. And sometimes those foundations and grant-making organizations or corporate partnerships might have non-discrimination requirements that are broader or go beyond those that are even required by Title IX or the federal government. So there could be something going on in the background that we're not sure about. My gut tells me it probably came down to some sort of financial incentive or some kind of need for the appearance of being a more friendly institution.
Joe, you want to add anything to that?
Not really. I think that's very accurate. I think, sometimes also they might be a little bit ashamed of some policies and may not want to have them public, but still want to have the control. But, you don't know what's going on behind the scenes everywhere. So
maybe they thought that they could make these changes. Maybe people wouldn't notice or make a big deal about it. And then they could create the appearance of being non-discriminatory towards LGBTQ students, but maybe still through bishops and through honor code, the honor code office behind the scenes still enforce the same behaviors. But then when BYU students started holding hands and kissing and taking selfies, they realized, we went too far. And then they had to find a way to kind of regroup. Is that what we're thinking happened?
I think that's what happened, and it has been confirmed by a few second-hand sources. And I've discussed this extensively with Kyle Ashworth, who is really involved in this. And basically, the theory is that the church didn't expect for everyone, students, and including faculty and the honor code itself, the office that enforces the honor code at the universities, to interpret the removal of the policy to be like, okay, then that means that we're allowing it. Like, the church leaders were not expecting that.
John and Gerardo, I will comment that BYU is not the only institution that did this, switch and then take it back. There's other religious colleges that have also removed prohibitions on same-sex dating. And then when it became public through news stories or what have you, I think it's often donor and alumni pressure or religious leadership pressure to then reverse that change once it becomes public knowledge. So there may have been a lot of that going on here as well.
Yeah.
And there's a little bit of, this creates complications for students who are going to these universities as well, because the university will often advertise that they are Title IX compliant, but they have a religious exemption and they don't really explain what that means. And universities don't necessarily have to claim a religious exemption until they've actually discriminated against a student. So if they don't have these policies public, a student may not know or expect that they're going to be discriminated against. And then once the school discriminates against them, they find out that they have no legal recourse whatsoever. So there's a real notice issue with this, especially when they're very vague with these policies. It puts students in a really bad position because they get punished when there was no written expectation that they do something different.
Yeah. So that's really problematic. And this is complicated, Gerardo. You could talk about this if you want, by the fact that, some of the, let's just say gay Mormon celebrities, I don't mean that term in a derogatory way, but whether it's Charlie Bird or even Tom Christofferson, there are these men that are now basically admitting publicly that they're dating other men, maybe even holding hands and hugging, but they're basically saying publicly, hey, we can still date as long as we live the law of chastity, our bishops are actually letting us date. And so within broader Mormon culture, there seems to be this desire to say, hey, as long as it's law of chastity, it doesn't matter whether it's the same sex or the opposite sex, bishops being willing to do that. But then there's this weird double standard of, yeah, but not at BYU. And that's, Gerardo, tell me if I've got that wrong, because that's got to be confusing to a BYU student. They're like, wait a minute, the brother of a Mormon apostle is publicly coming out and saying he's dating, or like Cosmo, BYU's mascot.
He hasn't said it, but he hasn't said that he's dating. But David Archuleta did say. David Archuleta said that on the interview that you and I covered, John, that a high up leader in the church pretty much told him that he could date as soon as he didn't get married. Yes. So we know about these stories, that bishops are, and we know, I know for BYU students whose bishops have told them in interviews, oh, you're allowed to date a same-sex partner as soon as there's no sexual behavior. But then it's like bishop roulette. It's like it depends on if the honor code finds out. It depends on it's really gray how the honor code doesn't really want to say how it's going to deal with situations. Like the statement that they put out was like every situation is different, so we can't give like a definite answer for this. But I know I know of couples, same-sex couples, who the honor code know that they are dating, but the honor code won't do anything about them. And it maybe has to do with their status, maybe has to do with the blowback because they're influencers. I don't know. But there's this definitely double standard on how these policies and how these rules are being enforced.
And Paul and Joe, I don't know if you guys want to speak to the civil rights implications of like this environment where in the broader Mormon culture, the Mormon church is trying to, number one, the Mormon church realizes that conversion therapy, reparative therapy, celibacy, and mixed orientation marriages, for decades, the Mormon church was supporting those as the solutions to being LGBT. Now the Mormon church realizes those are all losers. So in the broader cultural context, it's trying to sort of start to open up and just say, okay, we don't want to give you nothing, so we'll give the appearance that sometimes dating that still falls within law of chastity is okay. And so we have Tom Christofferson and David Archuleta and others saying they're getting permission to date as long as they obey the law of chastity. But then you've got all these BYU students where the policy isn't explicit. They don't know what's safe. There's arbitrary enforcement of the law. Maybe Paul and Joe, you guys can speak to kind of the civil rights implications of what that environment must be like when your education, your career, all the money that you've invested, all the time, all of that is potentially at stake, including your housing. Paul, maybe you go first and then Joe.
Sure. That kind of ambiguity that you're describing, it almost always is going to hurt the students and serve to protect the institution. And so religious exemptions are dangerous for students because it leaves them in this sort of no person's land of, what is safe, what is not safe. And so what ends up happening is that most students, they respond to the fear. And so or they have secret relationships. And that is really unhealthy for them. And
why?
So
why is that unhealthy? Secretly dating people in the closet. Why is that?
So there's been a lot of research on the mental health effects of having to remain closeted, or what's called like vigilance. And what a queer student on a campus like BYU has to be is they have to be always vigilant. Their roommates could turn them in. Their professors could turn them in. If they are male and they act a little too feminine, or if they are female and act a little too masculine, or if they're non-binary, someone could see them and turn them in. So they have to be especially vigilant. That takes a lot of mental energy, physical energy. And it's also responding to this environment where the message over and over in your head is that something is wrong with you. And that can lead to anxiety, depression, and other adverse health consequences. So for being a student at these campuses, I met with a number of BYU students when I visited campus a couple of times and met with some queer students, and many of them will tell me, hey, I got engaged. I'm really excited. Don't tell anyone because I'm not going to announce it until I have my diploma in my hands, and then I will announce it. And so there is just this pressure and this state of vigilance that they constantly have to be in that's not true for any straight student who might have a crush or might want to get engaged or might want to date or hold somebody's hand.
And as someone with 2 kids in college right now, I've got a kid in grad school, I've got a kid in undergrad. College is hard enough these days with COVID, with just the academic requirements, with adjusting to being away from home, with the pressures of just being a teen or young adult in today's society. That's enough stress and pressure that's leading to all sorts of depression and anxiety. To have all this on top of it just feels inhumane. Joe, do you want to add anything to what Paul said?
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely true. We talk to students every day. The burden this puts on individual students is immense. It's so hard for them. I mean, like you said, you have all the other burdens of school, just living life, just making it through school is a huge task in and of itself. To have all of this massive burden that you're carrying around all day, every day, it can be crippling. It can really derail their careers. It can derail their school, which derails their future careers. It has huge impacts. And there's just a massive power imbalance between these big institutions and a young, vulnerable student who doesn't know a lot about the law, doesn't know a lot about procedures, doesn't know about what potentially their rights could be. And when you remove all accountability and oversight through this exemption, it creates a vacuum that just attracts abusers. And it leaves these students incredibly vulnerable to abuse. These are big institutions. They need to have accountability. They need to be, there need to be rules and procedures that protect these students because they are so vulnerable. So it's just unconscionable to leave students in this scenario with no protections.
Okay, so really quickly, just in parallel, I thought it was worth noting that in addition to the federal investigation going on against BYU happens to be up for accreditation, and that's a separate process, but it's also related. Paul, is there anything you want to talk about that? Because what we want listeners to understand is we're not just covering this news story so that we can provide awareness and sensitivity to BYU students. There are calls to action at the end of today's episode that relates both to the federal investigation and the accreditation process, both of which there are potential action items that we're going to be sharing with you at the end. If you're a community member, if you're a BYU student, if you're a BYU alum student, we're going to be giving you things you can do, and that's just some foreshadowing to help with both of those processes. But really quickly, Paul, do you want to talk about the accreditation process, which is separate from this federal investigation?
Right. Accreditation process is separate, but it's also a requirement to get federal funding is that you have to be an accredited institution. So there is a tie-in and a relationship to federal funding, which is where then Title IX comes in. So when you're looking at BYU's accreditation being up this year, what the accreditation agency is going to look for here are a couple of things. One, they're going to look at transparency. It's really important to accrediting institutions that educational institutions are transparent with their students about their policies, including disciplinary policies. So this could be an area of concern for BYU because it's flip-flopped, it's left things very vague. There could be a real transparency concern that the accrediting agency could look into. Separate from transparency, there are requirements around diversity and inclusivity and making sure that your educational environment is safe and inclusive and open to all students who want to attend. So that's going to be another area that the accrediting agency is going to look at. Now, institutions like BYU and other religious colleges, they've known that this is going to be an issue that's going to come up for them. So they have already made a lot of arguments and policy arguments. And I think that there's been some federal changes where accrediting institutions have to respect the religious mission of the educational institution when they're doing the accreditation and evaluation process. So as you can imagine, there's kind of squishy terms here Religious mission has to be respected, diversity and equality and transparency has to be respected. It's going to be a difficult job for the accrediting institution. But the important thing is that the public, students, alumni, community members should be involved in this accreditation process. And you can file a third-party comment or a complaint, and the accrediting organization will look at those. And those are very important to holding the institution accountable.
Joe, did you want to add anything to that, or I've got a question really quick, but Joe, do you want to add anything to that?
No, I think that's pretty complete.
Okay. So a question I have is, recently, and Gerardo, you've done a little bit of background refreshing on this. Elder Holland gave that famous talk at BYU where he basically called on, staff and faculty to pick up their intellectual muskets to defend the church's policies as they regard to LGBTQ individuals. We covered that. We covered his sort of smearing of Matt Easton. I always get his name wrong. Eastman or Eastman. What is it, Gerardo?
Easton.
We covered his smearing of former BYU valedictorian Matt Easton. But one of the things he even foreshadowed, it's almost as if he's aware that either with this federal investigation or the accreditation renewal, that BYU may be in the crosshairs. And that's where he kind of gave a little bit of foreshadowing, where he talked about the possible day when BYU might start to lose some of its affiliations with different organizations. Do I have that right, Gerardo? And then Paul and Joe, do you guys want to add anything to that?
Yeah, that's correct. One of the famous sentences from his talk was when he said that if we have to lose credentials, and he didn't say accreditations, but something similar. I can't remember the word exactly, but he said, so be it. If we have to die on this same-sex issue, we'll die on it. But yeah, see, he was definitely mentioning it.
Joe or Paul, is there anything you guys would want to add about any potential context to Elder Holland's statement as it relates to BYU? Anything you guys want to add to that? We'll go to Joe first.
I don't have anything specifically to say. It sounds like Paul's trying to talk, but maybe Paul's muted.
Go ahead, Paul.
Sure, I can jump in here real quick. Well, what BYU and other schools are seeing in the future, we don't know if it's the near future or the distant future, but what they're seeing is what happened during the civil rights movement for Black equality of Black Americans. And institutions like BYU, or most famously Bob Jones University, had religious beliefs that prohibited equal treatment of Black students. And eventually, those court cases went their way through the courts all the way up to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court sided with equality over the religious liberty interests that the schools were advancing. And so I think schools like BYU and other religious colleges sort of see the writing on the wall that probably will happen at some point with respect to LGBTQ students and LGBTQ equality. However, I think that they're feeling a little bit safer, or maybe a lot safer right now, given the current makeup of the United States Supreme Court. So probably they're thinking this isn't any time in the next year or two, but down the line, they're going to really have to face the music on this.
Yeah. I think, Paul, you brought up a really good point. I think it's a good time to address it. I've heard many times, even from LGBT advocates, especially in Utah, and it has to do with maybe the way people and LGBT people are raised in Utah. We're raised to believe that these exemptions are so embedded and written in the Constitution that there's nothing we can do about it. So therefore, we either should comply or compromise. But just in what yesterday, I was meeting with Joe and talking about this, and I said, well, would a religious university be able to claim an exemption because of our religious beliefs and discriminate on the basis of race? And like you just addressed, Paul, they wouldn't. A religious university today wouldn't be able to claim an exemption to discriminating on the basis of sex. On the basis of race. So, what my question to you, Paul, is like, what is the problem with the argument that these exemptions are embedded in the Constitution and that there's nothing we can do about them, so we should leave the issue alone?
That's a really important issue that you're raising. And how we see things at REAP and how I understand the Constitution is that when you're dealing with regulating a purely private organization, so let's say that the BYU schools were purely private. They didn't take any government money. They just operated on church funds. In that scenario, the ability of the federal government to come in there and regulate about LGBT equality or even racial equality is a lot more constitutionally problematic. But when you're talking about taxpayer money, government money, then the Constitution clearly allows the government to attach non-discrimination requirements to the receipt of that government money. Why? Because you don't have to take it. It's not mandatory that you take the money. It's not mandatory that you get into business with the federal government. But when you do go into business with the federal government represents all Americans, or it should represent all Americans, and then you take on those non-discrimination requirements. That's been tested in the Supreme Court, and it's been repeatedly affirmed that when government money is involved, non-discrimination requirements can be attached. So why do we hear so much about how, well, this is impossible, like we can't have civil rights without big religious exemption here? I think that's because some institutions like the Mormon Church and some of the evangelical institutions, they have a really loud microphone, and they have been blaring this message for a very long time and signaling to their political leaders that, look, if you want our votes, you are going to make sure that we are exempt from civil rights protections. And so it's really important when you're looking at civil rights laws that what we're talking about here are taxpayer-funded schools. And when taxpayer money is involved, the Constitution permits non-discrimination requirements.
That's helpful.
Yeah, that's awesome. And then I think you mentioned something really interesting about, this institution having a very large mic and putting these ideas out in to the rate that most people believe them today. That it doesn't matter if they receive federal funding, they should be protected. But like you said, in reality, these things could be challenged. But Joe, would you be able to talk to us a little bit about, just really quickly, what Title IX is? Because this is what the federal investigation is about, right? It's a violation of Title IX. So what Title IX is, and how the religious universities started getting this exemptions, and how Dowling Oaks was super involved with this whole thing in the 70s.
And then we can cover President Worthen's response about Title IX as well.
Yeah.
I think all that would be important.
Yeah, so Title IX covers anti-discrimination policies in the arena of government funding. It says that if you receive government funding, you cannot discriminate against anybody on the basis of sex in the provision of your educational program. So if your educational program is receiving federal money, you can't exclude students on unconstitutional bases. There is a religious exemption to Title IX, though, that says that to the extent that Title IX would violate the religious tenets, the sincerely held religious tenets of a university, universities are exempt. But there would also be an implied idea that that exemption could not also override the civil rights of students who are attending there as well. So, I mean, many religious universities have argued for a very broad application of this religious exemption to basically apply to anything that they might claim. BYU's President Oaks was one who really argued very hard for exemptions. He said that there should be a constitutional free exercise exemption, and that the exemption in Title IX was incredibly broad. And BYU has had
in the 70s, right?
Back in the 70s, yeah. And BYU and has had a big role in pushing that argument forward. It's one of these, we talk about how our institutions have put up barriers to civil rights movements over time. The institution I grew up in, which was the LDS Church, has also has worked very hard to put up barriers in this area that have slowed the civil rights progress for students that attend these schools.
Paul, is there anything you want to add to that?
No, I think that what we're dealing with here is there's a clash between the government's interest in providing education for all Americans, and then a religious liberty interest in respecting the religious rights of religious educational institutions. And what we're living in this moment is, where should that balance fall? And what we advocate for at REAP is that the balance should fall that for equality when taxpayer money is involved and when the safety of LGBTQ students is on the line. But this is going to be something that we're going to see continue to be fought over for quite some time.
So before we actually talk about BYU's response by Kevin J. Worthen, BYU president, I'm reading in the notes that Gerardo put together that originally Title IX was focusing mostly on historic discrimination against women who were having children out of wedlock or who chose to have abortions. Title IX was put in place to protect those sorts of scenarios. Is that right, Paul and Joe?
Yeah, so in the 1970s and 80s, where the government's interest in protecting women clashed with BYU and other religious universities, had to do in basically regulating women's bodies, their appearance and reproduction, and whether or not they would have access to certain programs that the schools only wanted to give access to men. So that's where these religious exemptions first started in the 70s and 80s. And it wasn't until the Obama administration that the government for the first time said that sex discrimination includes sexual orientation and gender identity discrimination. And so at that point in time, from then on, is where we've been dealing with issues of sexual orientation and gender identity as well.
So maybe then it makes sense to review Kevin Worthen's letter. Gerardo, we're going to be including a copy of this letter in our show notes. Is that right?
Yeah, we will.
Does somebody want to give just a description of what this letter is and why it was written? Who would be the best to do that? Gerardo, do you want to do that?
I can do it.
Okay.
Yeah, just really. I mean, it's pretty simple. It's just so OCR, Department of Education, notifies the school that they're under an open investigation, and so Kevin Worthen, on his role of president of the university, submits a letter responding to the investigation. And pretty much what he's saying is, we have the right to discriminate. We have the right to be exempt from this anti-discrimination laws from Title IX because we're a private institution. He submits evidence, including the Family Proclamation, as part of the Family Proclamation becomes evidence as why the church should be entitled to this discrimination. And then one of so on the slides there's two slides that we're going to show. There's just two excerpts from this letter that I would like Paul and Joe just to address really quickly, just so people can also know what kind of like the letter is about and what Kevin is, the president of the university, is claiming.
So if it's okay, I'll read an excerpt and then have Paul and Joe respond to it. Not in a combative way, just to sort of help us understand what's going on legally for the most part. So this is a letter dated November 19th, 2021, signed by Kevin J. Worthen, president of Brigham Young University. Gerardo's pulled out two excerpts that he feels most passionate about. The first one reads, BYU maintains that the text, structure, purpose, and history of Title IX make clear that the term sex is not ambiguous and refers only to biological differences between males and females, and therefore Title IX does not apply to discrimination, quote, on the basis of, close quote, sexual orientation or gender identity. Now, this is different than what you just told us, Paul, that came out of the Obama administration. So I don't mean to steal your thunder, but do you want to tell us, do you have a first reaction, at least legally, to Worthen's response?
Sure. And so as you note, that's what BYU maintains. However, that's not what the Department of Education maintains, nor is it what most courts who have addressed the issue maintain. You may recall that the Supreme Court recently issued a decision in a Title VII case called Bostock, where even with a conservative majority, the Supreme Court said in Title VII, which prohibits sex discrimination in employment, they said sex discrimination necessarily includes sexual orientation and gender identity discrimination. And Title VII and Title IX are usually interpreted the same way in this area. And in fact, a lot of courts have already been upholding that interpretation. So BYU is maintaining that, but so far that's not really a winning argument before the government and the courts, at least not in general.
I'm guessing BYU counsel is smart enough to know what you just said. Why would they make an argument that they know has already sort of gone beyond a 1970s interpretation? Why would they continue to sustain an argument that they know has not borne modern fruit, so to speak?
I think that they're hoping that they can convince maybe some more conservative judges of this interpretation and try to get it to the Supreme Court. And the hope might be that the Supreme Court would side with them on this issue on Title IX differently than it did on Title VII. That could be something that they're trying to do, but otherwise can't speculate too much on where they're going here.
Joe, is there anything else you want to add to that excerpt? Sorry, you're muted, Joe. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think that accurately describes everything there. I don't have anything to add to that.
Gerardo, anything you want to add? I know
Well,
you love these.
I think it's just interesting, right? Like you said, John, like it was really kind of mind-boggling to me that, you know, the church with top-notch lawyers that they would put out an argument like this when even the conservative Supreme Court has not agreed on this interpretation of sex. So it's just interesting. I mean, they want to say the courts and everyone else has been saying that, but BYU maintains this position that goes against everything that everybody else has said. It's just really interesting, right?
I mean, without pulling abortion into this, I mean, in a time when like the nation is, various states are actually toying with the idea of rolling back Roe versus Wade, which was implemented in 1973, and states are starting to consider their own more severe restrictions. I mean, this is a time in American history where judicial precedent is sort of really under siege. I'm not a lawyer, but is that right, Paul?
Yeah, I think that right now a lot of conservative advocacy legal organizations are really trying to push the boundaries as much as they can on a lot of these civil rights and freedom issues, and using religious liberty sort of as a sword rather than a shield, in the hopes of carving out as much space for them to discriminate or to regulate people while they have a conservative Supreme Court.
Yeah, every time I hear the Mormon Church say religious freedom, what it seems to be saying is we want to be able to discriminate. It's not, you said sword versus shield. It doesn't seem to be saying let us practice our sincerely held beliefs. It almost always seems to be saying let us discriminate against marginalized, vulnerable populations. Is that an uncharitable? It probably is an uncharitable interpretation. I'm sure the church wouldn't frame it that way, but that's just the optics from my point of view.
I think that's how it feels for a lot of the, young people who are harmed by these policies. Is they do feel like it's a sword being used to hurt them. Yeah. I think it's accurate from that perspective.
And I'll just bring up really quickly that Elder Oaks acknowledged that people feel that way on his speech to, he went as,
University of Virginia,
the University of Virginia, where he said people shouldn't think that we are looking for a license to discriminate when we're talking about these issues. So kind of like he acknowledges that people, think about these things that way.
Yeah.
And he might want to be changing people's opinion, but that's, like Paul said, that's how it feels like, especially for those who are experiencing the discrimination.
Sure.
And the battle for rights are always a fight. And right now it's a really crucial time to stand up and fight for students' rights and stand up for their civil rights, because the Supreme Court can interpret things a little bit different. They have a little bit of leeway. And you really have to fight, and you have to advocate for students' rights. You have to say that, no, you shouldn't be discriminated against. You do have these civil rights. And it's kind of on all of us to be really, really loud to advocate for these students who don't really have a big voice themselves.
Yeah, I love it. A quick shout out and thanks to Lisa Hayes. A few of you have donated through Super Chat, through the Super Chat feature of YouTube. We depend on your donations to make programming like this possible. So thank you, Lisa, and thanks to everyone who takes advantage of that feature. It's tax deductible, and it helps us keep this stuff alive. Okay, I'll read excerpt 2 from Kevin J. Worthen's response to these Title IX Office of Civil Rights complaints and investigations. Kevin J. Worthen writes, in this case, the complaint alleges that BYU's application of the Honor Code to its campus community violates the Office of Civil Rights Title IX policy. Specifically, the complaint refers to a letter dated March 4th, 2020 from Elder Paul V. Johnson, a General Authority 70 of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, then Commissioner of the Church Education System, to students, faculty, and staff. The complaint asserts that the Office of Civil Rights interpretation of Title IX is inconsistent with the Honor Code, which incorporates religious tenets of the Church of Jesus Christ regarding marriage, family, chastity, gender, and divine identity. OCR has previously recognized that BYU's Code of Honor is derived from religious tenets of the Church of Jesus Christ, and that where treatment of employees and students would conflict with the religious tenets of the Church of Jesus Christ, BYU is granted an exemption from those requirements. BYU is therefore exempt from any requirements under Title IX that may relate to sexual orientation or gender identity, to the extent that those requirements are inconsistent with religious tenets of the Church of Jesus Christ as reflected in the Honor Code. So it seems like their argument is, hey, we've got our sincerely held religious beliefs. Students sign the Honor Code and say they're going to follow the Proclamation on the Family. They're going to try and, that marriage is eternal, that gender is eternal, that there are fixed, solid gender roles, that heterosexual sexuality is the only type of valid sexuality in the eyes of God and in our church. And therefore, at BYU, we're just going to expect the same type of behavior that aligns with our religious beliefs. That seems to be the argument. Paul, do you have any legal considerations that might be worth taking into consideration? Then Jill will have you talk next. And go ahead and unmute yourself, Paul, really quick. Sorry.
Oh, all right. I think I'm unmuted. So what the Office of Civil Rights is going to do when they receive a complaint against BYU, what they're going to do is they're going to look at that complaint. And in this case, it's about the Honor Code and LGBT students. And then they're going to look to see, is there a religious exemption already on file for BYU that says the Office of Civil Rights acknowledges a religious exemption for BYU and you're exempt from Title IX. Okay, why we're in the situation we're in, where there's a federal investigation now of BYU for its Honor Code with respect to LGBT students. The reason we're in this situation is that BYU Provo has only historically asked for an exemption with respect to these pregnancy and other related type issues. They don't have anything on file for sexual orientation or gender identity. In contrast, BYU Idaho did request an exemption previously for sexual orientation and or gender identity, and that was granted for BYU Idaho. But the Office of Civil Rights is going to look at Provo and Idaho differently and separately. So there was nothing on file exempting BYU. They looked at the complaint. They said, this is a valid complaint. We're going to open an investigation. Now, what happens next is BYU is given the opportunity to claim the exemption. And that's exactly what they did in this letter. And they said, well, if you're not going to recognize our exemption automatically, then we're going to assert it right here before you. And we're going to be exempt from all these different requirements. And then unfortunately, the department, the Office of Civil Rights did grant that exemption. So what does that mean? Well, it could result in one of two things. Either the civil rights complaint and investigation could be dismissed any day now, or the investigation could continue if the Office of Civil Rights feels like something is going on at BYU that is not justified by their religious tenets. And that's going to be a real tricky area.
Yeah. Joe, would you be okay talking about just, this narrow, or what the Office of Civil Rights could do, like what could be the outcome of what Paul is talking about regarding doing a narrow interpretation of the exemption versus a broad interpretation of the exemptions that BYU is claiming to have?
Yeah, so right now the ball is in the court of the Office of Civil Rights. It has yet to be determined how granularly they will interpret this religious exemption. You'll notice that BYU basically asked for an exemption over everything, right? And if you say, well, I have X belief, therefore I should be exempt from every possible thing that could possibly violate that belief. OCR may say, well, you may have a belief in marriage between man and a woman, but does that mean that you can't provide physics classes to LGBTQ plus students? How do those things correlate? Does that mean you have to punish LGBTQ students differently than other students? So there is some possibility that the Office of Civil Rights may look more closely at that, but there isn't a real historical precedent for that in the past. And that's kind of up to the OCR's discretion, and we'll have to kind of wait to see how they handle these complaints.
Part of what I think is interesting and relevant here, and this is directly related to Gerardo and your amazing episode on Mormon Stories podcast, is that right now in 2022, it's legal to be same-sex married in the United States. And the Mormon Church believes in honoring and sustaining the law. It's right there in its own articles of faith. And so in theory, if a BYU student decided to get same-sex married, that would be a fully legal and legitimate decision to make. And yet that could get them kicked out of BYU. Mm-hmm. That's kind of bizarre, isn't it? It's not like we're talking about the illegal use of drugs or smuggling alcohol during Prohibition. Like same-sex marriage is a legal act that any other university, any other secular university in the United States should not even be an issue. It should even be lauded or approved of. Paul, do you want to talk about that at all? Because that seems interesting or weird.
Yeah,
terrible.
John, same-sex marriage is not only legal, it's a constitutional right. And so every American has the constitutional right to marry someone of the same sex. And so one of the arguments we make in our class action lawsuit against the Department of Education about this religious exemption is we say, look, this religious exemption burdens the student's constitutional right to marry the person that they love. And because of that burden, the religious exemption should be deemed unconstitutional. And so there really are some very significant rights that are affected here. And what may be causing some of this, if you're looking historically, is for the longest time in American society, LGBT people and their relationships were criminalized. You know, it was not that long ago that I would be a criminal for having married my husband, and now I have a constitutional right to marry my husband. So in some sense, there may be a little bit of catching up to do in terms of LGBT equality here, because what we've gotten ourselves into is this situation where religious exemptions become so broad that they're now burdening constitutional rights. And that shouldn't be the case.
Yeah. And really the argument that Joe was talking about really blows my mind, because would BYU, in my mind, they can't prove that, and this is my personal opinion, right? That BYU can't prove that their sincerely held religious beliefs does not allow them to give education to LGBT students in same-sex relationships. Like there's not a belief in Mormon doctrine or, you know, Mormon thinking that would impede the school from providing education to someone who has LGBT. And that's different from the argument from teachers. I know that's like a lot harder argument, you know, providing equality for someone who's employed by the university. But the fact that these are students who are paying to get education, that's a lot harder argument for the school or for the religious institution to say, oh, my religion tells me that I can't give you education because of this belief that I have. So that's just a very interesting argument.
And a piece of history that I think a lot of people just don't know about, is especially Orthodox Mormons, is the Book of Mormon, silent on same-sex sexuality. The Doctrine and Covenants, silent on same-sex sexuality. The Pearl of Great Price, silent on same-sex sexuality. Joseph Smith, silent on same-sex sexuality. All you have are these really barbaric, violent, offensive statements that were made starting in like the 50s with Ernest Wilkinson or Marky Peterson or Spencer W. Kimball. You know, yes, they start saying super homophobic things in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, but that's no different than when Brigham Young was saying that black people, you know, were evil back in the 1850s. Like, those prophetic utterances are not doctrine, and they're the types of statements that the church in 2022 is fond to say was just the men speaking and was just policy, not doctrine. And so what a lot of Mormons don't know is that the church realized that they actually had no scriptural foundation at all for its discrimination against LGBTQ members. And so it had to come up with something. And so the Proclamation of the Family, which many Mormons think of as this inspired document, you just have to learn the history of the Proclamation on the Family to realize it was like a legal brief drafted by evangelicals that the Mormon church like copied, pasted, redrafted, and then through enough editing processes elevated to the status of, quote, a proclamation, literally for legal purposes, to try and provide some sort of doctrinal foundation for its discrimination. And we all know now that Greg Prince and others have revealed the history, that was literally not a prophetic sort of a revelation from on high, but instead a legal maneuver copied and pasted from the evangelical Christians to try and give some sort of legal standing. Now, Joe, are you smiling a little bit? Did I get that wrong?
No, I'm really sorry. I'm watching the comments. One of my high school teacher who was really influential to me asked a really great question. So I was just smiling. I was really happy to see her on the chat.
Good. Well, let's call it out. What was?
It's Lori Embry, and she said, you know, but if it's equal, shouldn't it be acceptable for LGBTQ plus persons to do everything that heteronormative people do, date, hold hands, kiss, PDA, etc.? Those rituals are important. That's absolutely correct. LGBTQ plus students are held to a completely different standard than their peers. They don't have the same rights. It's not equal enforcement. So I can agree with that 100%. And it's nice to see you, Lori.
Thank you, Lori, for joining us. We should also highlight a comment made by Jeremy Heiner, who gave a super chat donation, wrote, as a former BYUI student, I am so glad that the church is finally being investigated by the government. I had to deal with years of shame, self-denial, and even self-hatred because of these schools. Also, Crystal, thank you so much. Crystal Schaffen, thank you so much for your donation as well. Paul, I don't know if you even are able to comment on the Proclamation of the Family and church doctrine or theology, or maybe Gerardo, you want to talk about that. Anything? Am I totally off base there? Is there some history there? Do you want to say no comment?
I can't really go into the history there, but what I can point out is, or what I can ask is this question. Should a proclamation or the statements of the leader of a religion be determining the civil rights that all Americans should have? I think that the answer to that should be no, but unfortunately, the way this religious exemption in Title IX works is it sort of outsources the definition of our civil rights to religious leaders. And those beliefs can change and shift with the wind. And that puts students in these dangerous kinds of situations.
Yeah.
And I don't know if I didn't clarify this earlier. I keep saying I grew up Mormon. I'm no longer Mormon, but I did have the history and background. But I remember, on a personal note, I remember when the proclamation for the family happened, and I had no idea that it was being used in this way. It seemed so innocuous, like it was taught us, oh, the church is pro-family. And learning the history about that, I think, is really fascinating. And it's just not what it was presented as, especially when I was growing up as a kid.
Yeah.
Heidi, really quick, Heidi has a comment. Heidi says, my family doesn't believe me about the proclamation. Is there something I can show them to prove it? Documentation or research. Gerardo, will you make a note to include Greg Prince's book? Would you say, Gerardo, Greg Prince's book is the best resource to describe the history of the proclamation?
Yeah, I think even Taylor Petrie has even more information. He has some really interesting documents that he can show. He has a book, and he has documents that he can show, like, that look exactly like the Family Proclamation. They have the same language. They're called proclamation by these evangelical organizations, and they came before the proclamations. It was almost, Taylor Petrie, I think he says, it was almost like the Family Proclamation was drafted with all these documents in the room, and they were like putting it together. But Taylor Petrie's book and Greg Prince's book.
Okay. And you'll Gerardo, will you remember?
I'll put links.
Okay. Really quickly, I think we should probably start working towards the close here, just to maximize the number of people who end up watching this. There are some action items that our listeners can engage in that have at least a small chance, and maybe even a meaningful chance, of making a difference. And we're going to be including this in the description, but they fall into kind of 2 or 3 categories. One is filing Title IX complaints with the Office of Civil Rights. We want to cover that first. And then there are making either comments or complaints regarding BYU's accreditation. And just to be clear, we're not trying to hurt BYU here. I'm a BYU alum. Gerardo's a BYU alum. There's a lot that we love about BYU. We want BYU to thrive and succeed. We just want it to be more humane to everyone, but also to specifically to LGBTQ students. And then we want, rise and shout, the Cougars are out. We want you guys to do well. So let's start with the Title IX complaints. Paul, do you want to tell our listeners who it is that can file a Title IX complaint and how they should go about it? Let's start there, and then we'll get to the accreditation comments and complaints.
You're muted, Paul.
Yeah, go ahead, Paul.
There you go.
Sure. Filing a Title IX complaint is really important and something that's easy and concrete that you can do. So you can just type in U.S. Department of Education, Office of Civil Rights, Title IX complaint. Just put that in Google and a complaint will come up, or a link will come up. You can do a form online and submit it to the Office of Civil Rights. Won't take you that long. Who can do it? Anybody can do it. The Office of Civil Rights has to receive these complaints from anyone. I think especially if you are a student or professor or an alum of BYU and you have some connection, even better. But anyone can file a Title IX complaint. You can just do it online, real quick and easy.
Is it true, Gerardo was mentioning that you guys are maybe it would be helpful for specifically current BYU students, professors, or staff, if they're going to file a Title IX complaint, that maybe they could contact you guys and you might be able to give them some guidance on how to make that effective. Is that right, Paul?
Sure. Yeah. If you're a current student or faculty member interested in filing a Title IX complaint, you can contact us at REAP. We're the reap.org.
That's info. Is that info@thereap.org? Is that right?
Yeah.
Yes, I believe that's correct for our email address.
Okay.
We do have some limitations on how many people we can help because we've been getting a lot of these requests, but we can at the very least point you to information on how to do it on your own and provide some information on that. It's really important, even if all of these complaints get dismissed, and just to be honest, there's a strong likelihood that they will be closed on the basis of the religious exemption. But even if that's the case, it's very important to make this record, to let the Department of Education know that this is an important issue and that they should really be looking closely and paying close attention. And maybe our political leaders need to make some changes to Title IX.
And I would say, in addition, as somebody who's worked with a lot of students helping them shepherd these complaints through, there are Title IX offices on campus. If you file with them, you then have to wait for that process to complete before you can file one with the OCR. It's much more efficient and much more effective to just file with the Office of Civil Rights initially first, if you can. Sometimes the schools can be really problematic. Not all schools are, but some schools can really drag out the process, make it really difficult for students to get relief. So that's a really important thing. And then second, as Paul stated, and I know, John, I listened to one of your episodes a few weeks ago where you were discussing, as a not-for-profit, it's very difficult. We're going against some really big entities that are really well-funded, that are powerful, and they can do a lot of things. We're just a small organization, a lot like Mormon Stories. We depend on supporters to help. If you want to help students, if you want to help, adopt a student so we can help them file their Title IX application, we'd appreciate any donations, any help that you could do, because it is really expensive. It takes a lot of money and a lot of time to be able to process these. And we're limited in what we can do by the resources that we have. So, I mean, we wish we could help every single student out there, but there are 200 of these religious schools across the United States as well. And there's only so many of us, and we only have so much time to be able to do it. So if you care about these issues, donate to Mormon Stories podcast, the people who are doing this work all across, No,
donate to REAP. So are you saying that they can donate to the REAP and go to the reap.org and make donations to support what you guys are doing? Because for this episode, don't donate to the Open Stories Foundation, Mormon Stories. For this episode, donate to the REAP. Where do they go to donate to the REAP?
Yeah, you can go to the reap.org. We have a button there. It's a donate button, just like every other organization. It provides you the information where you can donate. And, we use all of those funds to help the students, to advocate for them, to get their Title IX complaints processed. So, any help, anything you can give would help us help the students.
Okay. And Gerardo's pasting that into the comments right now. And we'll also, Gerardo, maybe we'll have a place in the show notes where it says donate to the REAP and then the link to the REAP in the donate button. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay.
And we're also tax deductible as well. So just putting that out there.
I love it. Okay. So, that's Title IX complaints. When we talk about a federal investigation,
John, do you want to open the link I just sent you, just so you can show really quick the PDF, and it can just be a glance, but just to give people an idea on how easy it is, because it's honestly not complicated at all. It's literally just asking your name, your information. You can even do it anonymous if you're a student or a professor. Maybe if you contact the REAP at the email that we said, if you're a student and a professor, they might be able to provide some guidance for you to do it by yourself. But it's a pretty easy document. You just go through it and answer it. It's a few pages long, and you just submit that.
Okay.
And you just sign it and date it.
Okay, so that form we'll make available in our show notes. Gerardo is pasting it as well. Thank you, Gerardo. That's a good point. All right, really quickly, in addition to Title IX, there's also BYU's accreditation that's up for renewal potentially. And there are two things that people can do, if I'm not mistaken. One is to provide comments, and the other is to file actually accreditation complaints. Paul, do you want to just talk about what's a comment, who can do comments, how to do comments? We've got some stuff we can put up visually as well, but maybe just talk us through this process if you want to, Paul.
Sure. And I'm less familiar with this process, but my general understanding is that for a comment, any member of the community can put a third-party comment, and that will be considered during the accreditation process. For complaints, I think that there might have to be some kind of institutional affiliation in order to do the complaint. So if you're a student or a faculty or admin at BYU, you can submit a complaint. But if you aren't, but you care about this issue, you can still submit a third-party comment, and that will be looked at by the accreditation organization.
Okay, and I'll just show in our description, we'll have how to make a comment. There's a couple paragraphs that actually explain. It's basically there's an address, third-party comment, 8060 165th Avenue Northeast, Suite 100, Redmond, Washington 98052. That's the instructions on how to submit a comment to the accreditation board. And then for the complaints, we'll also have a link for how to file the complaints. And it sounds like, I just want to make a general plea. It doesn't help to kind of spam these organizations with kind of, thoughtless, mean-spirited kind of internet spammy type comments. Let's do our best as a community. Let's have it be students. Let's have it be alumni. Let's have it be faculty and staff. Let's have it be people that are directly impacted. Write sincere and heartfelt comments and complaints. Let's not just spam these things with non-credible comments and complaints that then make them have to say, well, we're getting so much garbage, so much noise, we can't even really make sense of what's coming in. Is that fair to say, Joe and Paul?
Yeah, I would say in your comment or a complaint, focus on student safety and focus on transparency, because those are two things that the accrediting institutions really care a lot about and will look into. So I would say focus on that.
Gerardo, can you make a note of that? So as guidance in the comments and complaints, tell us again, Paul, the two buzzwords or the issues that are most at stake.
Right. I would say focus on student safety and also on transparency. And so student safety is pretty obvious, safety of LGBT students. Transparency, that has to do with, schools need to be transparent about what's allowed, what's not. And it's really confusing for students right now. And so accrediting bodies, they care a lot about transparency. So I would use that word.
Shout out to Marco, who says, I donated to the REAP. Marco, thank you for supporting the REAP. And I hope other listeners and viewers, even if you just donate $10 or $50 or $100, that those sorts of donations, if 100 people, we've had just 700 people watching or listening to this episode live stream, that means tens of thousands are going to end up listening to or watching this. If just all of you donated $10, that could be an amount of money that really makes a big difference. So thanks to Marco. And for everybody, please donate to the REAP, and we'll help these guys make a difference. Let's go ahead and start wrapping up our final comments. We're at the hour and a half mark. Joe, why don't we have you go first with any final comments or thoughts you have? Gerardo will let you go, and then Paul will give you the final word. Is that okay?
Yep.
Yeah, I'd say, as we talked about earlier, this is just a super crucial time to stand up and advocate for students. I was really inspired by the BYU's USGA group. They wrote a statement, in response to BYU's actions. I want to read just a couple of words of what they said. They said, this is the LGBT group on BYU's campus. They said, USGA exists to create a safe space for queer students at a university that is anything but safe for them. We're the longest standing queer BYU organization, and the university has continuously denied requests for official club status. By doubling down on their policies of queer exclusion, BYU once again sends the message to queer students that they are not welcome at this school. BYU, you can ban USGA from campus, you can force us to sign a changed honor code and then hold us to an unwritten clause. You can prohibit a rainbow lighting of the Y, but you will never win. Queer people exist at BYU. They always have, they always will. We protest every day in our classrooms, in the library, in the Cougar Eat, on the entirety of BYU-owned property. Our existence is our protest. I am incredibly fortunate to get to work with students every day. They're incredibly brave. They're under an immense amount of pressure. They have so much going on with their lives. And a lot of them are standing up to fight for the rights of other students because they don't want anybody else to ever have to experience the pain that they experienced while we were there. So it's just it's a privilege for me to get to be able to work and help students. We really appreciate your support on the podcast, John and Gerardo. You guys are excellent supports for us. And yeah, we've just got to we all have to do what we can to change this.
I said I'd have Gerardo go next, but Paul, let's have you go next. And then, and thank you, Joe. That was a beautiful summary. Paul, let's have you go next, and then we'll close with you, Gerardo.
Sure. Well, for all the students who might be listening, just want to tell you that you're not alone and that we have got your backs. And I think that legal battles, while I'm a lawyer and I fight legal battles are won and lost, sometimes not on actually the legal rules. They're won or lost on the people that are involved, the human stories. So keep telling your stories, keep standing up. If you're an ally, please continue to stand up for the LGBTQ people who need you, and keep letting that light shine.
Thank you, Paul. Both you and Joe are doing great work. We really appreciate you taking the time to come on Mormon Stories podcast. We really wish you the best. Please, everyone, please support the REAP. And please let us know if we can help it in any other way. Okay, Paul and Joe?
Will do.
All right. Keep up the good fight. Gerardo, you are the one that made this possible today. You deserve all the glory and credit. Any final words, Gerardo?
Just want to say, John, that this is an issue that is very important for me and very important for many LGBT youth and young adults who are at BYU schools or who have experienced discrimination at LDS schools, and even at all the religious universities and colleges around the U.S. If I had to summarize with the most important subjects that we talked about, for me, the highlight of it all is I think, in my personal opinion, it's dangerous to believe that there's nothing we can do about this, that BYU receiving federal funding and getting these licenses to discriminate is embedded in the Constitution. That, I think that's a dangerous thought. And I think as a Mormon people, we have a bigger responsibility because it's our leaders who put all these blocks, legal blocks and bulletproof vests so they can't be touched. But it's my opinion, my belief that this can change and eventually will change. So we just gotta keep working on it.
I love it. Well, Gerardo, we couldn't do this without you. It's so great to have you as a friend, as a collaborator with Mormon Stories and the Open Stories Foundation, not only with the cinematography, but as a producer and as a co-host, and again, as a friend. So we love you, Gerardo. So grateful for you. Grateful for Joe and Paul. And thanks to all our listeners. Amazing comments both on YouTube and on Facebook. I want to thank everyone there. And I'll just conclude by saying we couldn't do this without the support of our donors. So thanks to all our donors. to Mormon Stories and the Open Stories Foundation who make this possible. Thanks to all the staff that includes, Brooklyn and Kara and Jennifer and Jen and everyone and our board, Clinton Carey. We're so grateful for everyone who supports us and makes this possible. Please, BYU students, please stay safe. I do want to remind everyone, I remember when Sam Young first reached out to me and he started doing the voting opposed thing, and not a lot came of that. And then he came to me and said, I'm going to do a petition to protect LDS children. And not a lot came of that. But then Sam Young just said, I'm not going to quit. And he started doing the marches for the children. And we all know that the little engine that could, Sam Young, ended up maybe making one of the biggest differences in the shortest amount of time that we've ever seen to Mormon policy. And I think we need the spirit of Sam Young in this movement. And Gerardo, you and Paul and Joe, you guys are carrying that torch. But also you listeners, you BYU students out there, BYU Provo, BYU Hawaii, BYU Rexburg, any BYU faculty or staff, if some of you can kind of take up that baton and just say, I'm going to be the little engine that could. I'm going to file my complaints. I'm going to file the comments. I'm going to address the accreditation board or the U.S. Department of Education. And I'm going to keep participating and engaging in this until BYU changes. It's those little engines that end up defying all of our legal judgment or legal expertise or our prognostications about what might be possible. It's all you little engines that end up breaking through that rainbow glass ceiling and changing the lives of BYU students in the present and in the future. The LGBTQ BYU students with people who just won't quit and won't give up and that don't believe the naysayers. So please don't give up. Please keep fighting. Paul, Joe, and Gerardo, you guys keep fighting. And all of you listeners, do your part. Follow the instructions in our descriptions. File the comments, file the complaints. And maybe in a year or two, we're going to see a very different environment for BYU, LGBTQ students, BYU students everywhere. Fair deal?
Sounds great.
All right. Thanks again, everyone. And thanks for joining us on Mormon Stories podcast. Please stay tuned. We'll have other great episodes in the days, weeks, and months ahead. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.